Hello and welcome to the AIM webinar series. My name is Mike Allen and I serve AIM Inc. as their member engagement manager. AIM is the trusted worldwide industry association for the automatic identification industry. For nearly half a century, AIM has provided unbiased information, educational resources, and standards to providers and users of these technologies. AIM membership provides access to an insider's perspective on trends and opportunities, along with a voice in shaping the growth and future of the industry. AIM member benefits include education, advocacy, and community, as well as a role in creating industry standards through collaboration. AIM is an investment in your future. Before the presentation starts, I would like to discuss with you a few housekeeping items. First, you will notice that you are muted throughout the presentation. Please do not use the raise hand option during this webinar presentation. If you have any questions during the webinar, please click the chat icon on the top right of your screen. After this, you will see a chat dialog box at the bottom right of your screen. Make sure in the Send To box you select AIM Inc., and then in the box below type your question. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can after the presentation. Today's presenter is the Managing Director of Health Systems, Peter Lambert. Peter, take it away.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you everybody for attending. I have this opportunity as the 2018 chairman of the AIM Track and Traceability Subcommittee. I'm owner of Health Systems, which is a software company that brings software solutions for warehouse manufacturing and asset tracking. So we do a lot of work for customers in the track and traceability space. Previous to this, I was a senior vice president and corporate officer of a publicly traded company that had I managed $1 billion business segment with direct distribution and manufacturing operations in 38 countries. Multiple SAP implementations that I have lots of bruises from, and I'm also a Lean Six Sigma black belt. So while this is a software company, I fall very heavily on the business process continuous improvement side, is how to move businesses forward. Okay, Michael, and I am trying to advance the slide. Any hints? There we go. Got it. Okay, so let's just start with what is track and traceability. Track is pretty simple. Where is it now? Some companies struggle with that, but in principle, it's not hard. I want to know where something is. Traceability is a little bit more complicated in that it means where has it been in the past, and where can be location specific. It can also be condition specific, i.e. has the sushi been sitting on the receiving dock at 90 degrees for the last 12 hours? So some of this gets into what is the particular track and traceability requirements that a given operation is looking for, and they're all different. But in principle, I want to know where something is, and I know where it's been in the past. The other thing that's important up front is to say, well, what are the limits of my track and traceability? It could be I have a plant that says I have raw materials coming in and I'm going to combine these things into some sort of finished goods that I'm going to ship them to customers or distribution centers. You could also take that model and extend it to multiple companies, because the stuff that comes in to you from your vendors, do those vendors need track and traceability system, and do we need a daisy chain and connect the dots through multiple organizations with respect to track and traceability? Depending on the industry and the application, that could very well be the case. But just to talk through the economics of this today, I'm probably going to focus more on within these four walls, how do we work on track and traceability and what are the economics of it? Now, moving on there, track and traceability involves two key elements. It's business processes and systemization that gives me an audit trail from what goes out to what came in. And while I own a software company here, the bigger piece of this is really business processes. I mean, systemization can take business processes and be very effective at enforcing business process, enforcing consistency, collecting data that's important for ultimately having track and traceability But at the end of the day, it's the correct and appropriate business processes that really establishes the basis for track and traceability. Just as an analogy here, the program that we all probably use, Microsoft Word, is a software program. And you can get trained on here's where to make things bold, and here's italics, and here's where you adjust fonts, and all the rest of it. And you can learn all that, but you still are not, that doesn't say you understand grammar, punctuation, how to write a novel, how to write a technical manual. You really, by learning Microsoft Word, know nothing about how to write something useful. So that's kind of my analogy with business processes is the systemization is great and it's important, but none of it matters without appropriate business processes being thought up and established up front that are appropriate to the application. I will mention that the systemization today, people try to do track and traceability on Excel spreadsheets, and it's not only difficult and complicated because of the number of transactions, but people are busy, and people, including me, can fat finger things and make mistakes. So in order to have a robust track and traceability system, you really need to employ what's termed automatic identification and capture technology, which in layman's parlance is basically either barcode, RFID, a way to be able to move things and make the transactions error-proof moving through the system. And the other piece is, all internal transactions and movements are recorded, and that's part of the business process is how do we get to that? We don't want to overburden the organization, but at various points along the way, if we don't know what 5 ingredients went into this end product, then we don't have track and traceability. So that's all part of establishing what are the business processes and how do we then automate it at the right touch points with AIDC technology, so at the end of all this we can get into the reporting module and actually know what happened. So this is just a diagram we created to try to give a pictorial view of this. If you start in the upper left-hand corner, let's say I have 4 ingredients, each represented by a different color truck. I've got to receive those. I've got to understand the lot numbers that I receive from my vendors. I'm going to put that in storage. And then at some point I'm going to use that, and I may not use it all in this batch. I may use some in the next batch, which starts to make things complicated, but I have to record the amounts of which raw material is going into this production run so that when they all get combined and put in this bag, that I know for the unique identifiers that I created to identify the various lots coming in, I can combine all those and say, okay, now I'm going to create a unique identifier for what came out, and I'll have traceability through that process that said so much of each of these lot numbers went into this final batch, and oh, by the way, I've got a unique identifier on that batch, so if I ever have to work backwards, I can. Ultimately, those things get potentially put in another box that has a unique label, and if this is simple, then only one set of a batch of this product would go into a box. If I have different batches going into that box, then I have to make sure that I know again what different batches went into this box, because this box eventually goes to a warehouse and may get put on a truck and go someplace where the customer is going to get it. And if I ever need to know from that package what went into it, I have to be able to work back through this entire process, back to those trucks and say what went into it based on any issue that might come up. So common applications of track and traceability, certainly food and beverage comes to mind. There's a law from the FDA called the Food Safety Management Act that requires track and traceability in the food and beverage space. They do not require the use of AIDC technology, so many companies think that they want to forego the investment in a robust track and traceability system and try to do this with Excel spreadsheets. In the medical device space, the law around unique device identification absolutely mandates that AIDC be used. So in those cases, it will be mandated for AIDC, as well as there is a global database that all this information has to upload to. Automotive, you think, well, why in automotive? I had a prospect last year that made 3-part seat risers for cars. Why would they want track and traceability? Well, as soon as somebody's in an accident, if the seat comes loose from the floor, there's lots of lawyers out there that would love to handle that case. Probably the biggest case in automotive that we're probably all aware of is Takata airbags. Takata airbags went bankrupt over that situation. They didn't have to. The reason those recalls kept expanding is because they didn't have track and traceability, and when the lawyers got after them and said, prove that this set of airbags doesn't have any of the components in the ones that exploded, they couldn't do it. In all likelihood, if they'd have been able to do that, they could have contained the damage to knowing just which airbags and components caused the explosions that were at issue, and the fact that they couldn't do it meant they had hundreds of thousands of airbags they had to replace, all of which probably didn't have the problem. They just couldn't prove it, and they lost their company. Aerospace, in the FAA mandates traceability for spare parts for airplanes to make sure they've come from approved suppliers. And then obviously in pharmaceutical, there's a patient duty of care around hospitals and ambulance companies and all the rest of it that says if a patient is harmed by a pharmaceutical, then we better be able to work backwards through the process and know where all the other batches of that pharmaceutical that potentially have that problem exist. So those are just some common applications, and there could be many others, but this will give you a feel for where track and traceability and why it's employed is in the industry. So talk a little bit about modern AIDC technology. Obviously barcodes and RFID tags have been around a long time. It's very robust technology. Barcode is typically less expensive, but you can get at it both ways. But in either case, we're essentially applying a unique identifier to an item, and we have the appropriate sort of automated data capture that every place that item goes, we can now, with the pull of a trigger, scan it. And now we have a time and date stamp of who did it, what transaction took place, and that's the information that ultimately gets daisy-chained through a report that says what happened all along the way. The good news is that as time moves on, there's an increased variety and price of scanners and printers. This is an uber competitive market. I work with these folks. I dare say I'm almost glad I'm not in their business because they all work really well, and the pricing on these things continues to get even more competitive. So it's no longer the investment that it once was. The other thing that's a recent technology on the scene is browser-based software. So in the past, most software and systemization was based around what's called a client-server model, where I have software sitting on a server, a black box with a fan and blinking lights somewhere. And then I also have to put software on the handheld scanner that talks back and forth to the server. And that's expensive for two reasons. Number one is that that scanner has an operating system, and the software company has to write their client for that operating system. So whether that is Windows CE or Windows Mobile or Android or iOS, there's essentially a different version of the software that goes on that scanner for every operating system of scanner. So not all companies wrote for all scanners, and it made it to where there was some speciality around the scanner with respect to which options you had that said, I want this scanner, I have this software, are they going to work? And it fundamentally limited the market for scanners because everybody was trying to make those choices. With browser-based software, there is no software on the device. So that does two things. Number one, any device can work because as long as the device has an internet browser on it, be it Safari, be it Microsoft Edge, as long as there's an internet browser, the software will work. So you disconnect the operating system on the device with the software that's being used for systemization. But the other thing that does, almost more importantly, is it brings the entire range of consumer volume devices into play because now you can run on an iPhone, you can run on a Samsung, you can run on their phones, you can run on their tablets, and fundamentally the consumer market is so much bigger in terms of volume and the price of the devices are so much lower that you now have access to a whole range of devices that weren't possible in the past because of that client-server limitation. The other thing that browser-based software can do is enable software as a service hosted in the cloud. So again, typically in the past there would be a local server that was required to install the software on, and then you had to do updates and protections and firewalls and all the stuff that goes with it. So you needed some sort of IT department to make all this work. With browser-based software, it can be hosted in the cloud by the provider, and there's no IT department required. There's a sign-on from any device that has internet access, and that includes Ethernet, Wi-Fi. It also includes mobile phone network, where you just get onto the internet and sign on to your system, and you're in business without any IT department at all. The other thing software as a service does, of course, is it limits your upfront investment because instead of buying the licenses outright with a lower monthly/yearly fee, however the provider does it, you can get into track and traceability at a much lower upfront cost, and we're about to talk the economics about that in a minute. The last thing I wanted to just mention is configurable software is, again, a new technology. Typically, in the past, software was written around dedicated applications. So the software company would say, I think there's 100 or 1,000 businesses out there that have this problem, and I'm going to code a bunch of ones and zeros and sell it, 100 or 1,000 times over. Configurable software is set up as what you would think about is software Legos. So every small step in the process is quote-unquote just another Lego, and the Legos can be put together in a way that customizes for an application. And particularly in track and traceability, everybody wants to have a simple solution, but companies' environments are difficult for reasons that aren't of their choosing. It's because this customer wants it that way, this vendor can only do this, and that vendor can do that. There's all kinds of reasons for why a standard package is not going to work for a lot of customers. And with configurable software, the Legos can be affordably arranged to customize around situational complexities without having to get down in the code and pay a software developer to be rewriting ones and zeros, which is an expensive proposition to get something to work for particularly small to medium businesses that don't have 6- and 7-figure IT budgets. So let's talk about the cost implications of having a track and traceability system. So what really happens here, and it gets back to business processes, is in the implementation to get to track and traceability, you're necessarily going to have to automate and make more efficient many of the things you do in order to get there. So that says, and we have lots of history of this, just direct labor alone, taking a physical inventory. I had one prospect that took a physical inventory every Friday. What an unbelievable waste of time and money to take a physical inventory as opposed to keeping track of the inventory as you go with robust processes and not need a physical inventory. Rework, when I make something incorrectly because I wasn't guided by the proper systemization, I'm now going to have to put direct labor into reworking that. If I send the wrong thing to the customer, I put direct labor into restocking it when it comes back. Inefficient stock movement, people wandering around the warehouse looking for things. We had an implementation at an auto parts supplier whereby just automating the warehouse, they went from 14 direct staff to 3. And that's just the cost of wandering around trying to find things and get them out the door, as opposed to a system that knows where it is and directs you to each of those locations in the most efficient manner. Obsolete or out-of-date product. You know, knowing when is the time expiry of something and having reporting to say, this is going to go out of date and I need to figure out how to sell it, use it, do something with it before it does. Inventory shrinkage. We had a customer that did the service on tow motor battery systems. And tow motor batteries are ganged together with heavy gauge copper wire, and then it's connected to the motor with heavy gauge copper wire. So this fleet of 70 service vans had lots and lots of copper wire. Well, with the price of copper, there was a lot of copper wire getting taken out of the vans and taken down to the recycling center to be sold to supplement the service technician's income to the tune of over $100,000 a year. So in all kinds of cases, you know, there's a lot of money associated not knowing with where things are and keeping track of them and making it efficient. You know, even something like costing accuracy, how much really went into something, both from a material and labor standpoint, and are we making money at this? So then indirect cost implications. The biggest is just excess administrative staff, because anytime you have inefficiencies, problems, rework, all these things, it affects the time and how much administrative staff you need for your operation. How much time does customer service spend on the phone talking to customers about either they got the wrong thing, what they wanted to do is what they expected is delayed, and why is it delayed? The accounting department has to process returns. The human resource department has to take care of hiring and all the issues associated with managing excess staff. You know, I know firsthand that when you have sales folks out there, it could be a problem with customer service, but the person the customer wants to talk to is generally the person that sold it to them, and they want to be right back in their telephone. So now you're taking away sales time because the sales individual is trying to solve a problem that was created in the back-end operation that couldn't deliver first time as expected. Same thing with service folks, and of course, supervisory and management folks, it ultimately flows up to them to spend their time trying to figure out, how are we going to load these trucks or call this company that says it's not going to be there, and can we ship a half load? It's a tremendous distraction to the supervisory management team that's trying to hold all this together that could be working on important things for the business to move it forward. I mentioned, hiring costs, training costs, because all of the things that can be systematized are otherwise needed to be trained into people, which is necessarily expensive, and they're just not as good at it as automated data capture technology. And then, of course, there's working capital. If I have excess inventory, and most companies that don't have efficient systems do, I had to finance that somehow, so that money could be in my bank account, or I could be investing it in other places in the business that have viable returns. Then there's the revenue implication. So how quickly can we deliver to our customers? How often do we keep the delivery commitment that customer service gave them at the time of the order? How often do we deliver accurately what was expected? How often are we out of stock on something because we didn't know and keeping track of how much we had, so now we're out of stock and now we're going to lose the order or tell the customer we don't have it? What kind of reputation do we get from product recalls? I think it's twice now that Bluebell Ice Cream has had to clear the store shelves of all their ice cream because there was wisteria or whatever it was, and suddenly there's pictures on the news of all these blank freezers in the Midwest because they didn't know what went into what, so the only answer is to take it all off the shelf. So not only did they have that financial implication, but after 2 recalls, I don't know who's buying Bluebell ice cream these days. Things like invoicing accuracy. So this all can come down to your reputation, and as Lee Iacocca once said, it takes 10 years to establish a reputation and 1 day to lose it. So, if you start losing revenue over inefficient warehousing and manufacturing processes, then the cost is really high. So back to track and traceability. I use the term track and traceability is free. In my business, there's a lot of folks, and I get this all the time, well, how much is this going to cost? It's not going to cost you anything because you're going to save so much more money than implementing this system would ever think to cost, because there's so much that the systemization is going to do to save money that it's going to far dwarf what you paid for it. And just to give you some feel here, if you think about that list of things that I went through, maybe depending on size, scale, complexity, let's just say track and traceability could be $10,000 a year or $50,000 a year. It's probably not going to be 100, but it's probably not going to be 2 either. So if I say that just direct labor, what does somebody cost a year? At least $25,000 with benefits and payroll taxes and all the things, maybe even more. So generally, track and traceability is completely paid for by eliminating 1 headcount. So maybe the operation isn't losing $100,000 a year in copper. I'm sure there's lots of other costs out there, but essentially 1 headcount in most cases is going to completely pay for track and traceability. So you have browser-based software, you get a range of hardware investment, you get configurable software that minimizes your customization cost. You can use SaaS to minimize upfront investment. So essentially you're saving out of the get-go more than your yearly charge to begin with. And that's what I would make the claim that track and traceability is free, because you're going to benefit immensely from all the things that you put in place to achieve track and traceability. that once you do all that and once that's paid for, track and traceability is basically a fallout of that. It's a reporting that says, now that I have all this efficiency in place, now I run the reports and I have my audit trail anytime and any place I need it. So with that, Michael, I think we can move to the questions or comments.
Well, thank you, Peter, for that great presentation. And it does look like we received a few questions for our AIM webinar Q&A session. First question we have here, there seems to be a lot to implementing track and traceability. Where do you start?
That's a great question. Track and traceability is not trivial, and at least in the way we try to approach it is using a philosophy we call crawl, walk, run. And track and traceability, cradle to grave, is definitely running. It's not trivial, and we just don't come in one weekend and turn it on. So it starts with, as I said, the business process analysis. You know, all businesses are different, but I would say all things equal, I like to start in distribution just because distribution is the thing that next touches somebody's customers, and that way I can take cost out of the operation as well as hopefully provide for a better customer experience and put something that's efficient and workable and believable as being my outreach to things that impact my customer. Also, as I gave you that example, distribution typically is a very easy place to save money, save direct labor, because the cost of people wandering around a warehouse trying to find stuff and get it out the door and get it kitted correctly and on the right truck, typically if you start in distribution, again, all other things equal, I spare my customers from all my dirty laundry and all my ills. And number two, typically you can get enough cost out of distribution to pay for the entire thing moving forward. So while each situation is different, that's typically where I would start, all things equal.
Okay, great. Another question that we received, it's about return on investment. Discussion on it's really useful. Clearly, business process analyst is needed to find where this makes a good impact, return on investment to avoid a future catastrophic unanticipated event like the Blue Bell recall, or really expensive, usually are hard to quantify the return on investment and justify the investment in these systems. You've mentioned others. What are you hearing from customers that are the most impactful return on investment that get executives excited?
Yeah, well, it's typically what you come down to is this may not be the most impactful, but the reality is direct labor and headcount or inventory shrinkage, product that goes out of date because it's obsolete, that stuff can get measured very easily, so it tends to be measured very easily. What's harder to measure is, okay, I've taken 20% of the workload out of the customer service group that are no longer, you know, spending time on the phone doing this. So parts of people are a lot harder to measure, and it takes a lot more management input to say, well, if I've taken 20% off of everybody's workload and I got 10 customer service folks, clearly I can lose one, because the nature is that when things get more amorphous like that and harder to measure, people will find other things to do because they want to keep their job and their health insurance. So I tend to argue that the larger savings tend to be in the SG&A. However, those are harder to get at because they're harder to measure. And the ones that are easy to measure is I went from 14 folks in my warehouse to 3. I saved $100,000 a year in inventory shrinkage around copper. I saved so much money because we threw out X amount of out-of-dated product 2 years ago and we threw out none this year. So it's those things that are easy to measure are the ones that tend to get measured and tend to get believed more than the ones that are harder to measure and kind of parts of people.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to try to combine two questions together here. One we received said, are other countries requiring traceability? And going along with that, someone else asked if you were familiar with the EU Tobacco Products Directive, which apparently provides for the establishment of an EU-wide track and trace system for the legal supply chain of tobacco products, as well as a system of security features to help detect illicit products.
Yeah, so the tobacco product and that, I'm not tremendously familiar with that in the EU, so I'll say up front, the EU does tend to have harmonized rules across a range of industry, whether it's, return of hazardous substances, there's a lot of individual regulations that pertain to specific industries. I'm not aware that, they're a part of the UDI because UDI for medical devices is global. I am not aware of any food safety management regulations, although the EU tends to be pretty tightly governed, so it wouldn't surprise me that they're there. I'm just not familiar with them.
Okay, and another question we have, you mentioned that web-based SaaS, software as a service, to create simple no software solutions are popular now. There's also lots of conversation about edge and fog computing to do some of the system processing locally to prevent delays from massive data transfer to the cloud. Do you see these as viable options for the future, or are track and trace systems less data intensive and may not require these new systems?
Yeah, so the answer is the latter. The amount of data that goes back and forth from a handheld in Iowa to an Amazon Web Services data center is such a nit compared to today's networks that you could run track and trace for 100 years and not to get to, 1% of the download data from a CIA satellite. I mean, it's just unbelievable orders of magnitude different. So while this feels complex and data intensive, we're the lowest 1% of what goes through these kinds of systems, both from a network standpoint and from a data center standpoint.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, what is the most important thing to consider before starting a project?
I think the most important thing to consider, and this is something that we provide consulting services, is that this is not an IT project. It ultimately results in software and systemization and the like. This is a business process project. It's business process reengineering. It's business process optimization. And the starting point is to realize that it is the business leaders, the people that run things, that need to have the time commitment in their life to, and this is hard, from running around with your hair on fire trying to keep the operations going, hoping that the IT department's going to come save the day. There needs to be bandwidth amongst the people that know the details of the business and what's going to work and what's not going to work before you even think about the software IT implementation side of it.
Okay, and does track and trace provide other benefits other than labor and traceability, such as brand protection, inventory management, etc.?
Yeah, and that's what I tried to get at in the presentation. It's all of the above. Like I say, we all have heard about Takata. Maybe some of us have heard of Bluebell ice cream. I certainly have. I follow this kind of stuff. But, it goes back to that Lee Iacocca quote, is it takes you 10 years to establish a reputation and 1 day to lose it. So part of track and traceability is a risk mitigation strategy, but I understand people would be only so willing to pay for the, how many millions of companies there are. Okay, you could say Takata got unlucky, but, the real issue for me is that you're going to have quantifiable direct ROI in your business from doing this, regardless of risk mitigation. So if track and traceability comes free, the whole insurance risk mitigation side of it also comes free, because you're fundamentally getting a lot more direct cost savings than you're ever going to pay for this system.
Okay. And does a track and trace system take a lot of time to implement?
It can or it cannot. It all depends upon the complexity of the business and how big of steps the customer wants to take. But that's why I will go back to first you crawl, then you walk, then you run. You do this in digestible chunks, because the absolute thing you don't want to do is implement something that's large and complex and have a whole lot of change management issues going on in your organization with training and all kinds of other things, and have that further impact your customers. So that's why with our business, that's why I tend to like to start in distribution, because it's something we can get our arms around. We can typically get nice cost savings from it, and we can get the piece of our organization that impacts the customers in line sooner rather than later, and then we can take steps backwards to the organization at the pace at which the organization can handle it. But having been through a lot of these in my life, and people will ask me, well, Peter, how long does it take to implement your system? To implement our system is entirely dependent on the critical thinkers and business operations folks having the time to sit down and make good decisions and gather the data and give it all to us to put into the system, because 80% of what's going on here really isn't, us or any company like us. What's important is the time it takes for the people that know the business to actually engineer out how they want to make it work and agree that it's going to work that way, and then take all the necessary steps to get the data and everything that's needed to put it into the system. The actual setting up the system and putting the data in is trivial compared to getting it all organized so that it's ready to be put in.
Okay, thank you. Next question we have is, what is the FDA Drug Supply Chain Security Act legislation?
Well, the one that I mentioned was the Food Safety Modernization Act. It's referred to as FSMA. That's on the FDA website. And then if you Google, I think it's FDA as well, if you Google UDI, Unique Device Identification, I don't know what the official name of the act is, but it's on their website as well. With all of the requirements, they split it up into Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3 medical devices, whether this is a heart stent that's going to go into the body, whether it's a replacement knee. There's different levels of criticality that require, well, certainly the timing of implementation was different, and in some cases, the specific labels and traceability requirements are specific to the class of the device.
And do I make business process changes before, during, or after system implementation?
So, good question. Some of the, and again, this will be something where it's really good to put the business process part of this in front of the IT system part of this, and make sure you have good consulting of people who've been through this before and understand the implications of, I make this decision, what are my reports and my outputs going to look like, in the future. Certain business process changes you have to make before the implementation, because they're necessary to achieving the track and traceability. They need to be in place and running, and if you can make them ahead of time, it just takes the level of some level of change management out of it for the employees. If I can't do it before, certain ones I have to do during, but the ones that are after is really, again, it's a decision, but another term that we tend to use here is, people don't know what they don't know, and they think, I want this, I want that, it's going to work this way, it's terrific, blah, 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 yada, yada, and then you go do it, it's like, well, I didn't realize this unintended consequences, I didn't realize that unintended consequence. So that gets for us back to the crawl, walk, run is, let's start with the minimum set of changes needed to achieve the next level. Let's implement those. Let's get everybody comfortable with them. And then let's go ahead and phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. That's one of the reasons our software platform was designed around configurable Legos, because to come in with an omnibus, this is it, it's all or nothing system, is really hard on an organization to make a really big step at once. So we tend to like to take this in smaller bites, and with configurable software, we can add Legos and add complexity and capability as we go along. So that's the way we tend to approach it, but I'm sure there's other organizations that would argue for a different approach.
Okay, thank you. Another question we received is, how should I decide between things like barcode, RFID, RTLS?
Yeah, so that's, I think it just comes back to, that's somewhat systemization, but is also somewhat business process related. I mean, there's obviously cost is one issue. You can print a barcode for less than a 20th of a cent. You're probably not going to get an RFID tag for less than 5 cents, and they can go up to 25 cents, $1. So it depends what you're doing. Certainly, cost is one element, and like it or not, barcoding is by far the lowest cost. And from a complexity standpoint, even RFID says that RFID reader is going to pick up anything within range, and it may pick up more than what the person thinks they're scanning if they're scanning a broad area. So I would look at those as increasing levels of complexity and just say, if barcode works for you, it's by far the cheapest and the more robust. I'd start with, why does barcode not work for me? And if you got good reasons, then you can go look at RFID. And if that doesn't work, and the certain elements of RTLS, but those get more expensive and more complicated. So I would start with the cheapest and most robust and convince myself that's not going to work before I tried to get to a more complex system and a more expensive system.
Thank you. Have you worked with any drones to perform inventory scans?
I have not. I've seen them at the trade shows, and we're a house of software programmers, so I think our guys would love the opportunity to, but we have not gotten to that yet. But we tend to pride ourselves, whether it be ERP interfaces or FedEx interfaces or pick-to-light system interfaces. We've got a 30-year history of interfaces, so I'm sure the guys would love it if the opportunity arose.
Okay, thank you for that. Another question we have is, how do you create harmonization in track and trace technologies? So, for example, you have a computer made by Dell, but maybe a chip made by another company.
Well, with our technology, that gets back to browser-based technology. We're hardware agnostic. I mean, you can have a a Macintosh computer, and you can have, a Dell computer and a scanner that runs on Windows CE Mobile. You can mix and match all of that, and we don't care because we're browser-based. If you're going to go with a system that's client-server, then you have to dig through all those pieces and make sure that the hardware set that's available for that manufacturer's software can actually run on all the devices you're going to choose to use.
And can you comment on any work health systems or the industry as a whole is doing to leverage blockchain platforms for validating transactions and supply chains?
Yeah, so it's going to be a short comment is we have not been drawn into that as of yet. I fully suspect that we will be, but right now it hasn't gotten to the point where we have customers or partners or anybody talking about it.
Okay, interesting. Next question we have is, I have bills of materials, inventory levels, and other information in my ERP accounting system. How do I keep the information consistent with the same information in the warehouse management system?
Right. So this is very common is, WMSs are good at what they do and ERPs are good at what they do. And there is similar information in both. And there's a host of techniques for providing an interface between the two systems, whether these are APIs, CSV files, ODBC. There's lots of techniques from getting information from one system to the other. So we do that. Some companies add that. Some companies don't. But we're very familiar with that. And typically, and we have some protocols for this, what you need to decide is what's the system of truth and where do you replicate the data. So something like a purchase order comes in, and that's typically going to get put into an ERP system, but you'd like that purchase order to feed into the warehouse management system so somebody goes and picks it and then sends information back that says it's been picked, go ahead and invoice it. So in that example, the system of truth for the purchase order is the ERP system, and when it comes over to the WMS says, got it, I believe you, that's that. On the other hand, when the order's been picked and the inventory levels have been adjusted in the WMS, then the WMS is the system of truth, and those inventory levels are fed back into the ERP system, so when the accountants look at the balance sheet, look at current inventory, those numbers are correct. So that's a pretty well-worn path of an ERP WMS system interface that many to most customers are going to want just because it avoids double entry and it avoids mistakes.
Okay, thank you. And our last question for the question or comment section of the webinar, do you need to have serialization in order to have traceability?
No, serialization is one way to do it. Now, let's just get some terms here. Serialization is typically, I view as a serial number that I put on a thing, whether it be a drum of liquid, a circuit board, whatever. What you do need is unique identification of the relevant components. So I may not choose to serialize a 55-gallon drum of orange juice concentrate, but I have to give it a unique number with where it came from, the lot code, and other relevant information so that I can track that uniquely. So that's not necessarily serialization in a serial number, but for all the relevant components, and we sort this out in the business process, part of the implementation is what are all the things and at what level that are going to require a unique identifier that need to be transacted with that unique identifier through the process in order to make sure that we'll have track and traceability when all is left over.
Okay, great. Thank you again, Peter, for your insight and knowledge and for providing us with this presentation today. And thank you to our audience for their active participation. I hope that you all found this information to be valuable. And Peter, if you want to pull up your contact information and the AIM contact information as well.
Yeah, so if anybody needs to pursue any of this further, my contact information's on the screen, and I'd be happy to schedule time to talk to you about it.
All right, thanks again, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your day.